centuries, people with visible signs of venereal disease have been condemned or considered dirty, or just as often, sinful. After all, medicine wasn't that advanced, and STD infections were often life-ending, or at the least, made life extra miserable. In Mesopotamia, STDs were thought to be divine punishment. Upon its European introduction, syphilis was in fact deadlier than it is now due to no immunity amongst the populace. More often than not, STD stigma marginalizes already vulnerable portions of a population by falsely placing the sole blame of epidemics on them. But what role does STD stigma play in a present and future filled with cures and treatments? In this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we'll explore how ignorance and stigma have impacted and dehumanized two important groups of people a part of the American fabric as much as anyone else: sex workers and the LGBTQ community. We'll also talk about how this impacts the Black community. While we will be talking about syphilis in the 20th century, to understand the intense fear of venereal disease during that period, let's begin with the brief history of what used to be called the pox. Nowadays, you can get a cure for syphilis quickly and discreetly. Though it carries a social stigma to many, as all STDs do, it's one of the ones you can get rid of. This is a modern luxury. For much of its long history, which stretches back to at least the 15th century, it's been a bringer of decay, madness, or death. Its first known European outbreak was in 1495. An Italian doctor said, "It most often begins with the private parts. Nothing could be more serious than this curse, this barbarian poison." European countries, not knowing it likely was brought over from the New World, squabbled over who birthed it, with Italians and Germans referring to it as the French disease and the Dutch calling it the Spanish disease. Later, Turks called it the Christian disease, and so forth. When syphilis presented itself in unfortunate victims, symptoms included genital sores, large rashes, ulcers, and abscesses on the body. Rashes turned black, and ulcers could gnaw into bone and destroy noses, lips, and eyes. The smell that came from these sores were horrifying. Sleep at night was especially difficult as muscles and bones groaned from pain. Syphilis also addled the brain, causing people in advanced stages to go insane. I didn't mean to rhyme, I really didn't. Treatments were slim, and the one believed to be the most effective, mercury, was actually poisonous to the body. From the 16th to 19th century, most experts thought syphilis and gonorrhea were the same thing, and religious folk thought the appearance of venereal disease to be a shameful, carnal scourge of sin. But it was also, of course, attached to women, who were the natural blame for all sexual problems in the world. In this macabre French art from around 1851, syphilis and its eventual decay and death are represented by enticing and seductive women. In 1905, a German zoologist found the bacteria that caused syphilis, and shortly after, the rush to cure it was kicked up a notch. In America, this coincided perfectly with the social hygiene and purity movements we discussed earlier in the series, but also fit perfectly with xenophobic sentiments about the influx of Mediterranean and Eastern immigrants, who doctors and social critics claim were bringing syphilis to the country. In cities like Baltimore, the pox came to be associated with Black people who had less access to education about STDs and condoms. Single women, sex workers, and charity girls, interchangeable signs of loosening morals in America, were also obvious targets. There was a hierarchy of victims when it came to syphilis, especially when social purists began noting the largest chunk of prostitute clientele were middle-class men, who of course carried diseases home to their families. For example, women or children who caught the illness because of a philandering husband, or men who were exposed after hooking up with a seemingly nice girl, those were sympathetic victims. Medical literature targeted these victims of the disease, not single women with syphilis, as they were assumed to be whores. Some social workers saw them as fallen women who needed guidance back to righteousness, and others saw them as insidious and immoral women, but all agreed that they were the carriers of the disease that threatened America. This didn't mean progressive era reformers agreed on how to act on syphilis, though, with some believing education, treatment, and rationality would yield results, and others believing that earlier stigmas of shame should be reinforced. Early social hygienists thought syphilis could be eradicated if everyone possessed a staunch sexual ethic, while ignoring or attempting to convert those who didn't embody the right values, similar to early reactions to AIDS that it was a punishment for homosexuality. All the while, the social stigma of syphilis meant most cases went unreported, and death from syphilis was often blamed on something else. At At the start of the century, many larger American cities and populated regions had red light districts or brothels, where working girls could ply their trade with relative ease. At the start of World War I, the military found that 13% of drafted men had venereal disease. In response, the government sought to curb the debilitating illness by controlling and policing the bodies of women. This wasn't the first time, as during the Civil War, Union Army officials in Nashville gave operational licenses to sex workers who submitted to and passed medical examinations. This was Plan B, as Plan A, in which the sex workers were shipped away on a literal ship to Cincinnati, was a failure. The licensed sex work program was short-lived and ended with the war. During the intensity of World War I, the government would bring back one aspect of it, the medical examinations. But first, under federal pressure, cities began shutting down red light districts, one famous example being the shuttering of Storyville in New Orleans, a setting we'll discuss in episode 8 of Let's Talk About Sex History. As in previous wars, sex workers still gravitated towards military camps despite shut down red light districts. In 1918, Congress passed the Chamberlain-Cahn Act, which gave the government the power to forcefully detain, quarantine, and examine any woman suspected of being a prostitute, and therefore having a venereal disease. Over 30,000 women who lived in larger cities, mill towns, or areas immediately near military camps were forcefully detained, and by 1919, 30 states had erected detainment centers. The term prostitute was a broad one that encompassed professional sex workers to good-time charity girls to troublesome teenagers. But more often than not, the term went hand in hand with classism, as poor girls were the main target. Women with venereal disease were automatically assumed to be prostitutes, which meant women who caught an infection didn't go to the doctor. In case you're thinking, but they were being cured, it was for the greater good, or something else along those lines, keep in mind that prior to the introduction of penicillin as a cure in 1943, the few available treatments were painful and often ineffective. The recommended treatment required 60 or more weekly visits to the clinic, with lots of painful injections. Also, the fact that there were no similar laws for men effectively cast syphilis as a whore's or woman's disease. It also completely ignored the idea of syphilis being transmitted between men, reflecting a society that had yet to label and come to terms with homosexuality. Misogyny, stoked by a society that was giving women more freedoms, a break from centuries of tradition, made the foul, loose woman a better target than an incurable and microscopic disease. Even though it was known that condoms prevented syphilis, the government didn't provide them to troops and instead focused on sex workers. Educational materials were issued that warned soldiers with sayings like, "A German bullet is cleaner than a whore," and another one read, "A night with Venus, a year with Mercury." Unsurprisingly, rates of syphilis remained high. After World War I, syphilis was rebranded as a disease that threatened innocent members of white America, not just soldiers. Congenital syphilis, the type that passed from pregnant mother to her newborn child, was a major fear. In 1938, 26 states prevented marriages of individuals infected with syphilis, and many required blood testing before marriage and mandatory reporting laws. This number had grown to 34 by 1980. Also after World War I, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiments began, iterating not only America's depth of cruelty, but its desire to find a cure for syphilis once and for all. More and more, the illness was being branded as a disease that affected black people the most and therefore made their sexuality all the more dangerous, skewed by the fact that whites were more likely to see private doctors, less likely to be subject to mandatory reporting, and had greater access to prophylactics and money. Recall earlier that recommended treatment involved multiple weekly visits to the doctor, which became quite expensive. Thanks to poverty, rates of syphilis were exacerbated among the lower class. This parallels the 18th century case of Flora Price, a poor Londoner who went to her church for help after getting the pox and got imprisoned at a workhouse along with mercury treatments. Her reality was different from wealthy Londoners who contracted syphilis, as they could drop bans on private treatment without judgment or punishment by the church or social organizations. But by 1943, penicillin was being used to treat syphilis successfully, and no longer was syphilis a lifelong sentence that meant one would end up in an insane asylum or without a nose. While the fear subsided, the stigma of the STD as a mark of inferior citizens like sex workers, immigrants, or other minorities did not. When HIV rolled around a few decades later, the stigma would not only marginalize homosexuals, but put black lives significantly at risk. When the CDC identified what would come to be known as AIDS in 1981, it announced its primary victims were young gay men, implied to be white, as they hadn't mentioned the 2 black HIV-positive men in their report. While HIV was initially attached to white homosexuals, this was a tragic mistake. In 1968, a 15-year-old black teen named Robert Rayford checked into a St. Louis hospital with warts and sores covering his genitals and legs. By 1969, after what temporarily appeared to be a bettering condition, he had trouble breathing and a decreased white blood cell count. He died 3 months later, and an autopsy revealed he had Kaposi sarcoma, which later would be discovered to be a major AIDS-related illness. A 1987 blood test would confirm he had AIDS. Throughout the 70s, people died from the same strain likely brought in from Haiti in 1966, but the dots weren't connected. The documented dead included a sex worker and her 3 children, a Norwegian sailor and his wife and child, the daughter of a 16-year-old drug user, and a 30-year-old Dominican woman in New York. But when the CDC made their announcement, the illness quickly became gay. In 1984, a journal asserted that they had traced HIV to a gay flight attendant who became known as Patient Zero. This was easy for the public to grasp onto when it later became mainstream yarn. After all, the largest portion of the ill were gay men, which historians and activists have attributed to a nuanced combination of newly found freedom, the anonymity of bathhouses and bars for men who presented as straight in their day-to-day lives, the ignorance surrounding the spread of HIV, and government neglect. But for many Americans at the onset of the outbreak, AIDS was the symptom of a society with loosening morals, and homosexuals were just the carrier. Just as it was easier to blame marginalized prostitutes and women of low morals for syphilis just a half a century earlier, it was quite on trend for America to let homophobia dominate public discourse about AIDS. To truly get it, you'll have to understand the homophobia that permeated the air in the 70s and 80s. Early rebukes of same-sex behavior in America were about the sin of sodomy, but by the 19th century it came to be seen as a vice by medical professionals who wanted to identify the cause and cure it. This concept flourished more or less well into the 50s, when in 1952 the American Psychological Association classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. During this time, homophobic attitudes were increased by the Communist Red Scare and the related Lavender Scare. Frightened that communists were infiltrating the government, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI proclaimed homosexuals to be enemies of the country, saying they'd be highly susceptible to Soviet blackmail. In 1953, Eisenhower banned homosexuals from working in the federal government. And in 1961, homosexuality was addressed for the first time on TV in a California broadcast called The Gay Ones. Homosexuality was described as a problem. In 1965, Time magazine ran a headline saying, "Homosexuals can be cured," reflecting a growing trend of queers who underwent therapy to be cured. It was called conversion therapy, in which victims were subject to torture and abuse that could include electrocution and lobotomies, and they were often put in such situations by concerned family members. Psychiatrists of the day claimed that homosexuality was the result of a maladjusted home life or a problematic childhood. Magazines claimed homosexuality was most rampant in big cities, not accounting for southern queers who were under stricter moral expectations and more intricate grapevines of town gossip than their city counterparts. There were no national, well-moneyed organizations for self-identifying LGBT members to reach out to for help. There was no social media to ease the trauma or find like-minded groups of people. This was the backdrop of the Stonewall Riot and the beginning of LGBT liberation in the 70s and 80s. While people were marinated in homophobia, the LGBT community, mainly white lesbians and gays, were still beginning to benefit from new decisions, ideas, organizations, and legislation. The APA removed homosexuality from the mental disorder list in 1973, a dozen states repealed sodomy laws, and Elaine Noble, a lesbian, was elected to the Massachusetts state legislature in 1974. Many LGBT groups began lobbying for protections in cities and states across the country. All this despite the efforts of conservatives like singer Anita Bryant, who galvanized the backlash to a proposed Miami ban on homosexual discrimination. This momentum for political change was severely affected by the AIDS crisis.
We're going to see them going out and publicizing their lifestyle and influencing our children.
God's plan for man was Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Dannemeyer leads a group of conservative Republicans who hope to make AIDS a political issue. Controversial are proposals to find and segregate those exposed to AIDS, to prohibit those with AIDS from working in health care, to make it a felony for those in an AIDS high-risk group to knowingly donate blood, and to prohibit children with AIDS from attending school.
The gay rights community faces its biggest challenge as the Supreme Court hears argument today on laws in Georgia and about half the states that prohibit anal and oral sex.
There's only one sexual act which is legal in the state of Georgia, and everything else can get you 20 years.
Initially, AIDS was seen by conservatives to be God's wrath, a rightful punishment for those living sinfully. This homophobia was reinforced by the rumor that HIV only spread from male to male, which inevitably wreaked havoc on scores of heterosexual couples who weren't monogamous and didn't get tested. A year before the CDC announcement, evangelical Christian leaders sent a letter to Jimmy Carter begging him to stop the advancement of gay rights. It's only natural that Reagan, put into the presidency by a largely conservative base who felt Jimmy Carter wasn't conservative enough, wasn't pressed about HIV until it became associated with more than just homosexuals, drug addicts, and degenerates. While HIV became more of a threat in the mid-80s, homophobes launched attacks on proposed LGBT protection bills under the guise of caring for public safety.
We know to a certainty that AIDS is transmitted in great measure by homosexual conduct. The thought of removing that statute from the books, which prohibits homosexual conduct, does not seem all that timely to me.
Discriminatory behavior against HIV positive and queer people ensued as the fear of HIV spreading from touching, saliva, air, and more ran rampant. This is similar to the early 19th century, when nativist and xenophobic American doctors claimed that syphilis could be spread by pens, pencils, toilet seats, doorknobs, and drinking cups. But when HIV began to affect more than the gay community, it became a real priority. Even though AIDS had been on the CDC's radar since 1981, Reagan didn't address it until 1985, when at least 12,000 people were already dead from it, including hemophiliacs. Under his neglectful nose, HIV spread through donated blood plasma used to create medicine for hemophiliacs. When Ryan White was infected after a blood transfusion and became a national symbol of HIV's ability to touch any average citizen, the desire for a cure intensified. Rock Hudson's death, along with celebrity pleas like from Elizabeth Taylor, made the issue more pressing, and more money was poured into efforts for a cure. An ineffective, expensive, and toxic cure named AZT was introduced in 1987. While the drug would later be replaced, the trend of expensive drugs would continue. After Magic Johnson got HIV and made it public in 1991, the stigma of AIDS as a gay disease lessened, and government programs, local churches, and grassroots organizations targeted various groups with a bit more zeal, though as contemporary critics pointed out, they weren't doing enough. On World AIDS Day 1994, Surgeon General Dr. Joycelyn Elders said, "Our children have seen 15,000 hours of TV to only 11,000 hours of reading, writing, and arithmetic. We've not used the most powerful medium, that's our television, to educate our people against AIDS. That says our country has really not made a commitment." The same year Magic Johnson revealed his diagnosis, it was reported that AIDS was 16 times more common in black women than in white ones. Fears abounded that HIV was a government plot to eradicate the black community. This notion is continued, with the 2010 study reporting that 49% of a sample of black men believed HIV was engineered by the CIA. This is somewhat understandable when you remember that the news about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments broke just 9 years before AIDS hit the scene. That wound of rightful mistrust of both the medical field and the government was still fresh. Another bad stereotype that permeates the black community is the belief that HIV is a white gay illness, or simply a gay one. Initial posters by AIDS organizations were designed to encourage safe sex as a weapon against HIV, featured homosexual couples going with the safe sex is sexy angle. The CDC and other government resources focused on making it clear that HIV could affect everyone. Some AIDS organizations believed resources were being diverted away from the communities that needed them most. Wrote a New York Times reporter in 2001, 3 years after it was reported that 49% of AIDS victims were black. Much of the government's $600 million AIDS prevention budget was used to combat the disease among college students, heterosexual women, and others who faced a relatively low risk of contracting the disease. Recent statistics put the percentage of new HIV infections in 2017 at 48%. We have to talk about why. Conversations about queer history and the history of the AIDS crisis in America tend to center gay white men, and this has been to the detriment of the black community. Members of the black LGBT community remembered friends as far back as the 70s suffering from drastic weight loss and swollen lymph glands. It's entirely plausible that black queers of the 70s were dying much earlier than in 1981, and that it's the death of white queers that first brought the illness to national prominence. This is thanks to classism and racism, two things that haven't disappeared as time has gone by, but neither has ignorance or stigma rooted in homophobia, which exacerbates black HIV rates. Consistent patterns across samples show that homophobia is most common among older, less educated, and religious citizens of the Midwest and the South. Hold on to that thought. After successful and far-reaching campaigns in the 90s, America stopped focusing on HIV/AIDS domestically under Bush. As you learned in episode 4 of Let's Talk About Sex History, this was also the same time abstinence-based sex ed and homophobia became more common. So about those HIV rates. The black community has suffered from HIV disproportionately, and for various reasons. Before you go touting the down-low black man stereotype, raw dogging in the streets and bringing it home to his wife, or the notion that black queers don't use condoms, studies have found that black gays and bisexual men don't engage in raw sex more frequently than their white peers. In fact, as Keith Boykin points out in his book, Beyond the Down Low, Sex, Lies, and Denial in Black America, secret homosexual relationships among married men are not exclusively a black thing, making the theory of down low men being the reason for high HIV rates in the black community quite laughable. HIV risk comes down to availability of resources and classism. The down low stereotypes contribute to a dehumanizing, unhelpful, and ultimately homophobic myth. When Magic Johnson revealed he had HIV in 1991, people speculated immediately over his sexual orientation, so he appeared on the Arsenio Hall show to clear up the matter.
I'm far from being homosexual, you already know that.
It was the threat of AIDS impacting straight black people that galvanized community outreach. Homophobia is still very real in the black community. A 2014 study found that 20% of black Protestants believe HIV to be God's punishment for homosexuals. This is reflective of the country itself, with 17% of church-going Americans overall believing HIV to be God's punishment. When compounded by a stigma about HIV being a gay, dirty, life-ending disease that makes people think they don't need to be tested or scares them from doing so, and inadequate sex ed and expensive health care, it's not hard to see why black people account for 48% of new infections. This is due in part to the rate of black people routinely getting tested for HIV, which is 75% compared to white people's 14%. Even still, if you've watched past episodes of Let's Talk About Sex History, you know that southern states have been gutting sex ed programs and refusing to expand Medicaid. The South also has the highest numbers of people living with HIV who don't know they've been infected. Low rates of insurance of black people definitely exacerbate this. The highest HIV death rates are in Mississippi and Louisiana. Just 20 years ago, it was big cities that used to be filled with new HIV cases, while small ones had less cases. Now major city rates have plummeted, which can be attributed to less stigma around treatment, greater access to resources, and more support. But also, infection rates are higher in these small towns where the sexual network is smaller, meaning infections snowball. And in areas where lacking healthcare access or homophobic stigma mean less testing, sexual networks are more greatly compromised. The kind of good news? Between 2011 and 2015, HIV decreased 8% among black people overall and 16% among black straight men and 20% for black women, though it's still higher compared to other races. Even more heartbreaking and yet driving home the message that stigmatized and marginalized groups suffer disproportionately, over half of transgender black women live with HIV. In this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we explored how stigma, ignorance, and the dehumanization of marginalized groups wreak havoc on society at large. And you probably also noticed how class plays a large role in these things as well. What would have happened if instead of targeting sex workers during World War I, the government had prioritized teaching safe sex and passing out condoms? What would have happened if the Reagan administration immediately began searching for a cure for HIV and empathizing with homosexuals instead of seeking to marginalize them? I believe that in both instances, scores of victims who didn't fit the original bill of dirty whore or sinful homo would have been saved. If the stigmas around these STDs had been treated with rationality and the dissemination of accurate information, not sensationalized fears regarding the people carrying the diseases, a lot of lives would have been saved, along with those marginalized people. If homophobia and transphobia is addressed and attacked more seriously in the present, I believe members of those communities would benefit from greater priority put on their health and well-being. What do you think? In the next episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we'll be tying a lot of the themes we've explored together in an illuminating walk through a portrait of teenage girls' sexual desire in the American South. Thanks so much for watching.